Gail, can you hear us? Afternoon, Gail, can you hear us? You're going to shout it's behind you. Gail, can you hear us? Greg, are you there? Do you want to run? Adrienne, can we be cheeky and see, whilst we sort out the technical problems, would you mind doing your presentation, please? Oh, thank you so much.
Right, I will get going then. Can everyone hear me? Is this better? Okay. I'm going to be talking about parental alienation, domestic abuse, and the family courts in England and Wales. And the reason I'm talking about this topic, these issues, is because there is a substantial body of research which shows that post-separation abuse is one of the biggest problems for women leaving abusive relationships. And that child contact arrangements can be the key site for post-separation abuse. There is a consistent large body of research over the years, together with the Ministry of Justice Harm Panel report, and I'll explain quickly what that is because I'm going to refer to it again. It is a report brought out by a panel constituted by the Ministry of Justice, who produced a really seminal report in 2020, following a consultation in 2019 on risks of harm and the family court. All of this has shown that post-separation abuse and its repercussions for children can be exacerbated by family court proceedings. And in recent years, accusations of parental alienation against victims of domestic abuse have played a large role in making this worse. And I have to say that throughout the decades that I worked as a family lawyer, throughout the decades that I've researched family courts and domestic abuse, I've never encountered anything as problematic as the growth of accusations of parental alienation against women involved in family court proceedings. So let's make sure I've got this. Oops. Right, so where did it come from? Parental alienation originated from something called parental alienation syndrome. And this was a term coined by a US child psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Gardner, in the 1980s. And he described parental alienation syndrome as a child's campaign of denigration against a parent with no justification. And it results from two contributing factors: the programming or brainwashing by one parent of the child, and the child's own contributions to the vilification of the target parent. He based his view on his own caseloads, and he opined that the indoctrinating parent is usually the mother, and also that false allegations of child sexual abuse were very common in family court proceedings. And for severe cases of parental alienation syndrome, he recommended transferring custody of the child to, from the custodial parent, usually the mother, to what he called the rejected parent, usually the father, for deprogramming. So, what was the response eventually to Gardner? Well, one of the main issues was that Gardner was largely self-published and lacking in peer review. Oops, sorry, I didn't get onto the thing. Oops. No, sorry, I don't know how that happened. His views lacked any sort of empirical or scientific foundation. Very little support in empirical research. There was a clear gender bias to his view. He saw parental alienation syndrome arising out of women he saw had been deserted by their husbands, and he actually quoted, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." Harm to children. Lots of US children were removed in the 80s from their mothers and placed in institutional care or with fathers, some of whom may be abusive. And then his views on pedophilia were of great concern. And remember, his views arose during that time where there was a lot of, the child liberationists, libertarians, should I say, who had suspect views about sex between children and adults, the false memory proponents, all fed into this idea that really there's not something intrinsically wrong with sex between children and adults. It's the way we portray it. And these are Gardner's own views, which you can have a look at here on this slide. And so eventually by the 1990s, parental alienation syndrome was rejected as a diagnostic syndrome by the US courts, and it fell largely, although not entirely, into disuse. So what about parental alienation? So how has this grown and taken hold in England and Wales? Because believe you me, it has. So the context into which it emerged is also the context in which the difficulties for victims of domestic abuse being protected in the family courts also arose. And it really started in the 1970s, with the second wave women's movement, other social and material factors leading to more women in the workplace, more formal rights for women, a growth in the rate of single mothers, higher divorce rates, all of which led to this sort of increasing fear of autonomous motherhood, and this idea of a perceived crisis for the role of the father in the family. And social and legal policy sort of came to see the family rather than marriage, rather than marriage as the kind of the key to keeping families together, to what constituted a family. And there's a lot being written about how this notion of the welfare of the child in some ways is sort of constructed as a tool has constituted the father as a desirable presence in the family. Now, of course, this isn't to say that the father is or isn't a desirable presence in the family, but these are the discursive, material, social and political conditions that were happening from the 1970s to the 1990s. The Children Act 1989, bringing in this concept of parental responsibility, which had a powerful normative effect. The new Labour government, which strongly pushed this idea of the promotion of the participant father, the valorization of fatherhood. And of course, the fathers' rights movement played a key role, both here and in the US and in other jurisdictions. And if you read this amazing book, edited by Jean Mercer and Margaret Drew, Challenging Parental Alienation, there's a fascinating chapter by Julie Doughty and Margaret Drew on the whole history of how the whole movement towards shared care, the fathers' rights movement, pressing for shared care, arose from these events which led to more severe laws and enforcement of child support. What they said was, in relation to alienation, the goal of abusive parents in asserting alienation has progressed from a platform to avoid child support payments to eliminating the mother from any significant role in the child's life. So just moving on. Now I want to read you, if we have time, something about domestic abuse in the family courts. Most professionals were not aware of and did not understand the experiences of women and children living with domestic violence. Even if women were able to make professionals aware of abuse they'd sustained, these experiences often disappeared as they went through the process of negotiating contact. Most professionals rarely questioned how the use of violence may impinge on the quality of contact for the child, and saw children's opposition to contact as stemming from the mother's influence. Goes on to say the efforts of professionals were focused on persuading mothers to cooperate rather than on women's and children's safety. Women felt under pressure from their solicitors to agree to unsafe contact arrangements rather than be viewed as hostile or unreasonable by courts. Many women reported that the onus of making contact safe fell on them. Now, many of you who are familiar with the Harm Panel report may think, and would be justified in thinking, that this passage comes from the Harm Panel report published in 2020, or indeed from some of the research perhaps in Women's Aid research in 2016. It doesn't. This comes directly from the 1996 report of Marianne Hester and Lorraine Radford from their seminal study, Child Contact and Domestic Violence in England and Denmark. And it is remarkable how this is still so pertinent today, how so little has changed over the last 26 years, despite what we will look at now quickly, strenuous efforts. And it's what Hunter, Barnett, and Kaganas had called a cycle of failure, where there are constant efforts to try and make improvements, but which are constantly blocked by the sort of strong cultural, ideological, political conditions that push back against making any real progress. So Hunter and Radford's report led to a consultation by the Children Act Subcommittee of the Lord Chancellor's Advisory Board on Family Law, and to the seminal case of Re-L, as it's called, both of which in 2000 made strong pronouncements on the importance of taking domestic violence seriously in child contact cases, laid down guidelines for the courts. And I remember at the time we all thought, this is a remarkable achievement. Things are going to change. At the same time, though, you have these forces working against it. There was this consultation, I don't know if anyone here remembers it. In 2002, the government set up a consultation on making contact work to try and promote contact and enforce contact orders. And the whole issue of domestic abuse the whole discourse changed in these debates to one of false allegations, bitter, implacably hostile mothers making false or exaggerated allegations. And at the same time, in the courts, while the case of Re-L itself, interestingly enough, rang the death knell for parental alienation syndrome in the courts, because it was pressed in one of those conjoined appeals and it got nowhere. At the same time, we had to change from parental alienation syndrome to parental alienation, and a growing acceptance from then. Then we had more studies. We had the Women's Aid's 29 Child Homicides Report, a report by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Court Administration, the Family Justice Council, and so on, which all showed that the Re-L guidelines were not being followed. Women were still being pressurized to agree to unsafe child contact arrangements, which led to the president of the Family Division bringing out a fantastic practice direction, which was subsequently made part of the family procedure rules, called Practice Direction 12J. And it tells the courts what they should do in cases where domestic abuse is an issue. And if they only followed it in the spirit in which it should be followed and the letter, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you today. But a whole range of other studies subsequently found that Practice Direction 12J wasn't being followed. So we had more major amendments in 2014. At the same time, though, we have, this a consultation on what the Fathers' Rights movement was pressing for, was equal shared care, which ended in this compromise called a statutory presumption of parental involvement. Then we had Women's Aid producing the 19 Child Homicides Report, and many of you may remember this. Women's Aid launched an incredible Child First campaign around how child deaths, in some cases, were directly attributable to court-ordered child contact arrangements. This led to further changes to Practice Direction 12J. And, you can say it's a coincidence, but just at the time that this was happening, the Child First campaign, there was the debates in Parliament, a lot of publicity for it, changes to Practice Direction 12J, parental alienation suddenly came into the spotlight. In 2016, there was a debate on it in the House of Commons, calling it for it to be criminalized. It was in the media, family lawyers all over their websites and their blogs, portraying themselves as parental alienation lawyers, and to combat this evil, you must instruct a lawyer who understands it. And of course, what happened as a result after that, the continued cycle of failure. We then had, as I've already told you about earlier, an inquiry by the Ministry of Justice, published in 2020, which again exposed the harmful practices that were occurring for victims and children in the family courts. This led to a government implementation plan, and it was heralded as the most sweeping changes to family law. And it does indeed provide for a raft of amazing changes. And yet, and we also have the Domestic Abuse Act passed last year, which has implemented very slowly a few of these changes. In fact, a ban on cross-examination by alleged perpetrators of their victims has just come into force, finally. And yet, 2 years on, we have Women's Aid producing this report, 2 years too long, on what has, but more pertinently, what hasn't happened. So you can see the pressures we're under. And what are these barriers to focusing on domestic abuse, which lay the ground, and this is why it's so important to understand, for the way parental alienation seems to be taking over the family courts. There is some of these identified by the Harm Panel report, some by other research. This pro-contact culture, the idea of contact at all costs, a lack of real understanding of domestic abuse by family court judges, magistrates, and professionals. The gender bias we find in the family courts, where you have this innate suspicion and disbelief of mothers. If a mother raises allegations of domestic abuse, they're immediately met with, you know, what is she up to? Is this a tactic to prevent contact? The pathologizing of mothers. The idea of the sort of the silo working that the Harm Panel report described, what Marianne Hesse has called the 3 planets, where you've got different aspects of the system working completely differently. So the same mother could be involved in the child contact planet, in private family law, in child protection, and in the domestic violence sphere, and treated completely differently. And with no sort of communication between these different parts of the system. So these are a lot of the issues behind it. And what they can lead to is, firstly, a minimal application of Practice Direction 12J. You know, few fact-finding hearings, risk is inadequately assessed, domestic abuse being considered irrelevant, and parental alienation being constructed as the problem. So, sorry, I've lost my clicker a little bit. So, we're going on to parental alienation now that we understand the background and what the issues are. So, you may want to now ask, so what is parental alienation? But that in itself proposes that it is a thing. So perhaps we can ask, how is it understood? Now, there is no official or commonly accepted definition of parental alienation, and a large number of ways in which it's understood even by its proponents. Katz had defined it as the unjustified resistance or hostility from a child towards one parent as a result of psychological manipulation by the other parent. There's also a lack of consistency in how the courts interpret it. And if I had more time, I would tell you about a fascinating study by Suzanne Zakur in Quebec, where she looked at the different ways in which the courts constructed it. And I think probably Liz Sheehy and Simon Lapierre sum it up best, where they say it can be used, and remember, it always arises in the court context, so broadly as to designate any situation where a parent is perceived as engaging in strategies to exclude the other parent, regardless of whether the child actually rejects the other parent. So you have parental alienation claims where even on the view of a parental alienation proponent, you don't have an alienated child. I think, as Mercer and Drew explained, it can probably best be described as a belief system. Is this belief system accepted? Now, one of the issues is, one of the biggest problems, I think, is that however much some parental alienation proponents try and distance themselves from parental alienation syndrome, it still retains its roots there, and we can see that most strongly in cases of child sexual abuse. In fact, some studies have shown that whether it really is different from parental alienation syndrome is highly debatable and contested. Some contemporary PA proponents don't distinguish parental alienation from PAS. They use similar criteria, or they continue to advocate for the validity of parental alienation syndrome, while others try and distinguish their views. And research in jurisdictions like Spain and Italy has found that in practice in the family courts, there is little has changed from the changing use of this terminology. The next issue is, as Doughty and others have found, and there are also some chapters in the Mercer and Drew book, there is an absence of robust scientific or empirical studies on how it is or should be identified, understood, assessed, or treated. The majority are US studies with some with methodological limitations. It's not identified as a disorder or condition in either of the major international indices. And the theory of parental alienation has been strongly criticized by a range of organizations such as the American Psychological Society, the New Zealand Psychological Society, the US National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. It's been strongly deprecated by the UN, by CEDAW, and by Brevio, and by the European Association of Psychotherapy. So against that background, what do we know about the prevalence of allegations or findings of parental alienation in England and Wales? There is no empirical research or evidence available on this. There are no national generalizable studies on this. I did a small study analyzing the reported case law from the time it was first mentioned, which was in 2000, in fact, in Riel, up until 2019, and found a limited number of cases during that period. But from 2017, there was an increase. And indeed, anecdotally, and from emergent research, we can strongly surmise that claims have become prolific in the family courts. Channel 4 undertook a survey for the Dispatches program, Torn Apart, which has just been nominated for an award. And the survey found that allegations of parental alienation were made in nearly 70% of the cases of 3,655 parents who responded, and that approximately 85% of all alienation claims were made against mothers, and this was as reported by both mothers and fathers. It's still strongly gendered. The problems with parental alienation and domestic abuse. What my case analysis found, and many and other reports in other jurisdictions, is that there is a high level of domestic abuse in cases in which parental alienation is raised. The Channel 4 survey found that allegations of domestic abuse were made in 85% of the parents' cases, and parental alienation allegations were 5 times more likely to be made against parents who had made allegations of domestic abuse. Now, I must say This is not, this was a self-selecting survey, so the results can't be generalized, but it's still nevertheless a huge survey, the largest survey of family court users in England and Wales. The problems that have been found by research, by the harm panel report, are that victim survivors of domestic abuse are not only discouraged from raising allegations of domestic abuse for fear of being accused of parental alienation, but you know, not only are they discouraged, but they actually themselves are too scared to do so. And it essentially has been described by a number of researchers as a pseudoscience tool of post-separation abuse. In other words, in many of these cases, raising accusations of parental alienation is itself part of the tool of the abuser. And there's a quote here from Judge Jerry Bowles, who wrote the foreword to Challenging Parental Alienation. I won't have time to read it, but I'm sure we can make the slides available. He just sums it up so well there. I'll just wrap up with the consequences and effects, the most important of which are the way it dominates cases, puts the spotlight on the alleged alienator to the exclusion of all else, which means that there's no inquiry into why a child may be resistant to contact, and indeed plausible explanations can be ignored or overlooked. Increasing transfers of residence and willingness to transfer residence from protective parents to so-called targeted parents who may themselves be abusers. And I won't go on to the slide about experts, but which was the last slide, but can I just explain what this picture here is? That was a picture taken at Family Bridges reunification camp in the United States. So in the US, so-called alienated children can be forcibly, literally in shackles, transported from court to a reunification camp. And they can spend a week there, locked, say, in a hotel room or in a camp with the so-called target parent. And then they kind of worked on to try and get over their alienation. And at the end of one of these sessions, the children were asked to make a poster of what they felt about Family Bridges, you know, with the organizers expecting they'd make a nice, bright, happy poster. And that's what the children produced. So thank you very much. There is a slide on experts, but we won't have time to look at it. But can I just say, parental alienation is a huge industry, and the experts are the ones who are gaining from that.
That was with public health and having the multidisciplinary team working on this important issue so vital now going forwards. But thank you so much. I hope, Gail, can you hear me?
I can hear you and I can see you.
We can hear you. Thank you so much for your patience. Are you okay sharing your slides?
I certainly am. I'm going to do that right now.
Thank you. Over to you.
Let's check it works. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to the conference. I'm sorry I can't be in Manchester. So what I'm going to talk about today is the impact of pornography from the micro to the macro, and exploring the way in which we can approach this from a public health approach. Now, one of the things that happens is when I go around and lecture, and it really doesn't matter who I'm lecturing to, whether it's parents, whether it's pediatricians or judges, they really don't know what's going on in the world of kids today. So what I want to talk about is the fact that the media absolutely knows what's going on. And this is Details magazine, which is a kind of magazine for, it's kind of a cosmopolitan for men. And they had an article called How Internet Porn is Changing Teen Sex. And they quoted a pornographer called Joanna Angel. And she said, the girls these days, they just seem to come to the set porn ready. Now, of course, not all girls and women are going to end up on a porn set. But what she's saying is actually more profound than this. What she's saying is we are socializing our girls to see themselves as disposable sex objects. And this is a much larger issue than just the women who are in pornography, which in and of itself is a huge issue because these women are so debased, degraded, insulted, and also physically and sexually abused actually in the making of porn. But here she's talking about a wider issue. Now, the question is, how do girls get porn ready in a culture? So Neil Postman, the media expert, said once about print-based culture. And I want to be clear, we live in an image-based culture today. Kids growing up do not grow up in a print-based culture. It's image-based. And Neil Postman said, he said, when we lived in a print-based culture, we developed some immunization to the seduction of eloquence of the printed word, to which I would add, we have not developed any such immunization to the seduction of eloquence of the image. And when you think about what it means for girls to grow up in this culture, they are surrounded by hypersexualized images, where the women are usually white, large-breasted, toned, young. This is the image coming at them, dressed in hypersexualized clothing. This is from Victoria's Secret. And these used to be porn clothes about a decade or two ago, but now companies like Victoria's Secret has mainstreamed porn garb. Again, white, blonde, toned, God forbid anything jiggles other than the breasts. Every piece of skin has to be bolted down. Now, what is the effects of this on girls? Well, the American Psychological Association did a report, and what they found is that the more hypersexualized culture a girl consumes, the more likely she is to self-objectify. That means she internalizes the values of this, I would call it larger porn culture. And what they found is that the more she self-objectifies, the more likely she is to have anxiety, depression, body loathing, risky sexual behavior, early pregnancy, STDs, suicidal ideation, dropping out of school, self-harming, and she's more likely to be sexually victimized. So we need to think about how this is putting our girls in danger on many levels. Now, when I was really trying to figure out what was going on when I was writing Pornland, I kind of had a missing piece of the puzzle. And I kept thinking, I'm missing something. And who was it who really introduced me to what I was missing, who gave me the last piece of the puzzle? It wasn't a PhD in sociology, psychology, or media studies. What it was an incarcerated rapist. And he was, I was interviewing him in prison. And when he was talking about, and he used the word grooming, okay, he was talking about how he groomed his 10-year-old stepdaughter to, who he then went on to rape. And he said something that was so utterly earth-shattering to me. He said, the culture did a lot of the grooming for me. And then it was like light bulbs went off. I thought, that's exactly it. Instead of having an individual perpetrator having to groom an individual girl, which we still have, what we have now is a much more economical way of grooming our girls. We have a mass culture, a pop culture, grooming our girls en masse to think of themselves as, let's go back to Joanna Angel, porn ready. So it's no accident that the pornographer and the child molester is taking from the same playbook, because they understand the culture and what it's doing to our girls by mass socializing them into seeing themselves as disposable sex objects. So this is what we offer an adolescent girl. Either she conforms to the hypersexualized pornified culture, or she's invisible. So what I what you think of it in a much more succinct way, that either she looks fuckable or she's invisible. All her friends are walking around in the mesh tops, the low slung jeans, the a tramp stamp, they call it, which is the tattoo on the back. And what's she going to do if she doesn't dress like that? She's going to be invisible. And a critical part of even the DNA of adolescence on a social level is that they are visible. And how bizarrely are they visible? They're visible by looking like everybody else, by conformity. And after my lectures in high schools and colleges, I have young women lining up crying. One group's crying because they said, I chose fuckability, I hate it, but I have no choice because I can't stand to be alone. Another group will be saying, I chose invisibility because I can't do fuckability, but I feel awful. I'm alone all the time. I don't have any relationships. I'm completely isolated. So when you give a choice of conformity or invisibility, it's not a choice. You have, in fact, denied young women and girls the right to be the architects of their own identity and sexuality. And this is what happens in a hypersexualized porn culture. Now, back to the same article, how internet porn is changing teen sex. And they said there is an entire generation of young people who think sex ends with a money shot to the face. For those who don't know, this is ejaculation on the face. Now, I have watched more porn than any human being should have to endure. I don't think I've ever seen a scene that doesn't end with ejaculation all over the face. And in fact, it's so prevalent that one of the problems we have in the porn industry is that we have an antibiotic resistant strain of gonorrhea of the eye going around. So and also in studies, what they found is when they ask young men, what do you really want to do? What is the sex that you love to do? They always say, quote, coming on her face. And the reason for this, they say, is because we know she doesn't like it. So we now have pornography socializing an entire generation of young people, mainly men, who will get off on the fact that their girl or woman that they're with doesn't like what they're doing. That's the bit that's arousing. Now, when we look at the content of pornography, there was gold standard content analysis is Anna Bridges in the journal Violence Against Women. And she and her team found that of the 304 most watched scenes, 90% contained at least one form of violence against women. Now, Anna and her team have just finished doing a later study, which should be out soon, looking at 304 scenes, and the number has now shifted from 90. It's not 90%, the number is now 100%, which if anyone's familiar with porn will know absolutely, that should be no surprise. Now, what is the content of mainstream porn? It's gagging, where she's being gagged with a penis so far down her throat, she's choking. And as she's choking and trying to get away from the guy, he's actually dragging her head forward and pulling it more towards her penis. So often she's got tears running down her face. She's trying to get away, and he is stoic, just continuing to gag her. Now, it's very important we distinguish between gagging and strangulation. Strangulation are hands around the throat. Why is it important? In most countries, rough sex, which is usually strangulation, that ends in her murder. So this is not sex, this is violence against women. They use strangulation as a defense. Now, I know in the UK that you actually outlawed it. Here in the United States, you can still use rough sex as a way to, as a defense. Also, what we know is that the more women who are battered are strangled during sex, the more likely they are to die at the hands of the batterer. So this is a really important distinction on many levels. We have rough, pounding anal sex, to the point that one of the big problems for the women in pornography is literally their anuses drop out of their body and they're having to have them sewn up again and again and again. Ejaculation on the face, hair pulling, hitting, spitting in the face. So your standard porn scene on Pornhub, YouPorn, X-Hamster is a woman being orally, vaginally, anally penetrated by 3 men, calling her a bitch, a whore, a cunt, a cum dumpster, hitting her, strangling her, and then eventually all ejaculating all over her face. So she can't even open her eyes. They're so full of ejaculate. This is the standard form of sex ed today that the average boy, and we know looking at studies that it's between 8 and 11 is the first time that boys actually meet this kind of pornography. This is the free pornography. It's mainstream. Most importantly, again, I'm going to underline free. You don't pay for this. Now, when I was writing Pornland, I really was at a point where I couldn't stand it anymore. And I was thinking, if I can't stand it, how do these boys stand it? And of course, uppermost in my head was my son. And I was thinking, what would have happened to him if at 11, thank goodness he missed a lot of this, if he would have seen these images? And I thought, who would he be? Would he be the man he is today? And I'm pretty sure not. And I'm thinking, why do these boys stay on this? Because they don't put porn into Google. They put boobies, they put tits, something like that. And they think if they're lucky, they're going to see a pair of breasts. If they're really lucky, they're going to see a naked woman. They are not prepared to be catapulted into a world of what is really sexual torture. So what I was interested in was, how can they stand it? And I started to look at the texts that go with these scenes. And this is from Gag Me and Then Fuck Me. Do you know what we say to things like romance and foreplay? We say fuck off. We take gorgeous young bitches and do what every man would really like to do. We make them gag, etc. Now let's say this. This is really clever. We take gorgeous young bitches and do what every man would like to do. You know what? This is not true. Every man does not want to do this, but this 11-year-old boy has no sexual repertoire. He doesn't know every man doesn't want to do this. So there he is being pulled in. They sort of like a spider weaving a web to pull in this boy. Another example is the promotional copy for the movie Anally Ripped Whores. Now, again, they're very clear. They don't hide what they do. And everything you're seeing here, I got for free off the free porn sites. So going with this Anally Ripped Whores, which is images of absolute violence, they say, we at Pure Filth know exactly what you want. Chicks being ass fucked till their sphincters are pink, puffy, and totally blown out. Adult diapers just might be in store for these whores when their work is done. Now look at this again. We at Pure Filth know exactly what you want. No, you don't. You do not know. That 11-year-old boy does not want this. And yet what you're saying to him, are you man enough for this? Can you stand this? Because we know you. We know you better than you know yourself. And what 11-year-old boy is going to say, no, I'm not man enough for this. They even have signs sometimes above the worst of the scenes saying, are you man enough? Can you stand this? So this is, again, pulling this 11-year-old boy. And I want for a minute for you to put yourself in the position of this 11-year-old boy and imagine what's going on. In his stomach is a toxic stew of arousal, shame, fear, self-loathing. In fact, this is a form of trauma, right? This is a form of sexual abuse. To catapult an 11-year-old boy into watching images of sexual torture and violence is a form of sexual abuse. And I would argue is traumatizing to the point that we know undigested trauma, if you don't deal with it, you keep repeating the trauma. So if he's being traumatized by going to porn, the traumatic repetition is going to be going back to porn. So think of the brilliant business model. You're actually building in trauma so they keep going back. So you're creating potential adults. It's, again, a brilliant business model, absolutely terrible for the culture and for our kids. Porn sites get more visitors each month than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. This is not a small industry. Again, the major form of sex ed for kids all over the world. Now, the company that owns the most traveled porn sites in the world is MindGeek, which is located in Quebec. They control, I would say, anything from 70 to 90% of the distribution of porn. They control distribution at the distribution end of the value chain. They're not really big into production, although they do have some production houses. But if you think of the value chain of pornography, the money is made at the distribution end and controlled by MindGeek. Their biggest, most branded porn site is Pornhub. So just let me give you some statistics from 2021. 47 billion visits, 130 million daily visits, 962 searches a second, 5 million new videos added last year. Pornhub boasts that 100 million daily visits is as if the combined populations of Canada, Poland, the Netherlands, and Australia visited Pornhub every day. So what do we know about the impact of pornography? 40 years of peer-reviewed research, and we're looking at psychology, we're looking at pediatrics, we're looking at sociology, we're looking at media theory, it's multidisciplinary, found the behavioral risks is that porn consumption increases the risk of sexual intercourse at a younger age, higher number of partners and casual sex partners, engagement in risky sexual and casual sex, erectile dysfunction, yes, in kids, low libido, preferring to have masturbating to porn than having an actual sex partner, and that they're more likely to physically aggress, sexually aggress, and verbally aggress against women. So the effects are profound. The psychological and mental health risks, and this is all, by the way, from the journals, risky consensual scripts. That means that it increases the objectified notion that women should be sex objects. A creation of a disintegrated, inauthentic sexual identity, alienation from self and others, avoidance of emotion, limited capacity for empathy. It undermines self-awareness, sexual regulation, impulse control, poorer body image, lower self-esteem, depression and anxiety. This is what happens. The more younger a kid gets to porn, the more they watch. These are the findings. The future. In 2003, hardcore porn producer Jules Jordan said one of the things about today's porn and the extreme market, the gonzo market, so many fans want to see more extreme stuff. What's more extreme stuff? Kids. This is all over Pornhub. Look how young she looks. We don't know what age she is because there's barely any age verification with all the Disney characters. And then things like this, it's okay, she's my stepdaughter. And I'm just going to read what it said here. These young stepdaughters may seem innocent, but don't let them fool you. As soon as mom leaves the house, stepdaddy's cock becomes the target. And the only thing that will calm the aching, throbbing, dripping pussy she's been playing with all day. These girls crave cock and will find any reason to get it from their new stepdads. Now, what this does is it gives men who are masturbating to what they think are underage girls a get out of jail free card. Why? Because she's the sexual predator, not him. He just happens to be enjoying this, but he's not the predator. She wants it. This is her inner slut coming out. And when you go onto the websites in Pornhub, the largest number are having young looking girls, teen category, the step category, the daddy category, the cheerleader, the teacher, babysitter, stepdad, solo female. This is where all the young looking women or girls end up, and they are the most visited categories in all of the porn sites. So porn and child sexual abuse, what does the research say? Now, this is where we really go down a rabbit hole. Clinical experience and research evidence are now accumulating to suggest that the internet is not simply drawing attention to those with existing pedophilic interests, but is contributing to the crystallization of those interests in people, and it should say men, with no explicit sexual interest in children. What this means is we have a new category now of men who are not pedophiles, who get into porn, get desensitized, bored, become addicted, look for legal childified images like the ones I've just shown you because they're on Pornhub, and then they go into child sexual abuse images. This was the path of all those men I interviewed in prison, and not one of them was a pedophile. And when I said to them, are you a pedophile? They were insulted. They said, of course we're not. We prefer sex with adult women. So I said to them, why did you rape a child? And you know what they said? We got bored, wanted something new, wanted something fresh. So now we have expanded the number of men who are going to rape children, and we've expanded the number of children who are at risk for men. So we have this toxic culture. We're going to have to clean it up for our kids any which way. And in culture reframed, we take the Gulliver strategy. Tie this monster down. And by monster, I mean the multi-billion-dollar porn industry. At Culture Reframed, we took the public health approach. Our mission is to raise awareness and provide free education resources to build resilience and resistance to hypersexualized media and porn culture. The public health approach shows that the key protective factors are parents, educators, legal professionals, medical professionals. We build programs, all free, all online, built by people with PhDs, MDs. You go on free, you go through our programs. Culture Reframes parents programs are engaging, they're professional. So the goal is to get parents and professionals to give them the confidence, skills, and knowledge to have these conversations with kids. All of our team is multidisciplinary. Our programs are step-by-step modules. You can download them. We have online educational videos. We have a family tech guide. We have guided conversation scripts so that you even have 12 conversation scripts after our parents of tweens and our other program parents of teens to how to start these conversations. Just some of the sample topics that we cover in our online programs. So why Culture Reframed? We say if we, the parents and experts, don't talk to young people about porn, the porn industry will. So the question is, who do you want to get there first? Us or this multi-billion predatory industry? Now you can contact me through Culture Reframed or just DG Dines at Culture Reframed or just info at Culture Reframed. And I just want to end by saying one thing. At some point, a young person will come up to you and will say, where were you when all this was going on? And you have two choices. One is to say, sorry, I didn't know. The second is to say, I fought tooth and nail against this, that you would have the right to develop your own authentic sexuality. And if we change the I to the we, you know what the next sentence will be? We won. Because we are unstoppable, especially women, when it comes to providing a sustainable, loving culture for our kids. Because you know what? We've got to say to the porn industry, enough. You have no right to hijack our kids' sexuality, their identity, their sense of self. You have absolutely no right. And I stand here with many of you saying, we have to do something to stop this. Thank you. Just need to stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you, Gail. That was a phenomenal talk, and I know there's loads of questions, but we're hugely behind schedule. So I am going to ask for any questions that we can send to Gail via email. But just double checking if Joan is with us.
Yes, I am.
Hi, Joan. Thank you so much for your patience.
Of course.
Thank you very much. And please do start as soon as you can share your screen.
Okay. Well, I'm honored to be here with everyone and a little bit gobsmacked by Gail's presentation, but I'll try to just move forward. Thank you, Gail. My study is really builds on Adrienne's opening. It is a study that I launched in the mid-2010s, around 2014, to gather data on what was actually happening in custody courts in the US, because we had been fighting in appellate litigation, in scholarship, in education and training. We had been fighting to get children treated better and better protected in custody battles with abusers. And we were failing, and I decided we really needed data, objective data, to help educate the world about this, especially the courts and the lawmakers. So I had founded an appellate organization called DV Leap in 2003, that stands for Domestic Violence Legal Empowerment and Appeals Project, to focus on appellate advocacy for abuse survivors and in the DV field. And I had not intended to do custody. I really didn't want to do custody, but I had no choice because we were flooded with custody, desperate custody situations. And what we were seeing was that the parental alienation label was very difficult to get over or around, and that this was particularly true when mothers were coming to court and claiming some kind of child abuse, physical or sexual. First example from a case in Arkansas, the evaluator, this is a court-appointed neutral professional, says to the child, "What is your biggest worry?" The child says, "My biggest worry is my father killing me and saying my mother did it." That to me is the perfect encapsulation of parental alienation. The child understands it intuitively, that the father would kill him just to pin that on the mother and to hurt the mother in multiple ways and on multiple levels. What does the evaluator say about that? That the boy's negativity toward his father is unnatural and abnormal. Excuse me. It is a manifestation of parental alienation syndrome. Sorry. Second example from California in 2013. Father brutally orally raped the mother. She managed to catch it on tape. He's sent to prison for 6 years. But nonetheless, there's a court battle over visitation and whether the children have to be sent to visit him in prison. And the evaluator is speaking to the child who says, "I don't want to be around my daddy when he's mad." The evaluator reports to the court, "Frankly, this child is afraid of Mr. H." Nonetheless, the judge goes to a luncheon with an alienation speaker, interrogates her about it, gives some version of the facts to her, and she responds with some canned alienation advice. He comes back to court and says, "Mother has created a revisionist history about the father's treatment of the children. The boy's fear is merely collateral damage from the wife abuse and the product of her conscious or unconscious statements to the children. So we don't have to worry about the boy's fear because he didn't intend it when he abused her, and she has consciously or unconsciously influenced them. So no problem here. We won this case on appeal, thankfully." That's just to give you a taste of how alienation is used in real cases with real facts. So, and those are just the tip of the iceberg of the kinds of cases we were dealing with in DB Leap and that I continue to hear about. So I started this study. I was incredibly fortunate to recruit 4 social scientists who knew much more than I did about this type of statistical research, although it wasn't really that statistical in the end. And what we did was we wanted to get a national picture because the only research existing until then was state-based and it was court-based. And so you had a couple of studies with people who went into courts and looked at files and then analyzed outcomes in relation to state statutes. All the states were different, all the statutes were different, all the procedures were different, and it was really hard. Those studies just had no impact on the picture or the awareness of what was going wrong, even though they were pretty consistent with what we all knew. We were determined to get a national picture. The only way to do that was to do electronic research. We couldn't go to every courthouse in the country. And luckily, by the time we started the research, most opinions, at least appellate opinions, were published online. And so we were able to gather, we did a 10-year period from 05 to 14. We spent months developing an electronic search to identify the right cases. We wanted cases in any private custody cases, meaning not state child welfare cases. Any battles between parents over custody or visitation involving abuse or alienation. To our horror, we netted over 15,000 cases. The coders spent over a year going through them and triaging them and narrowing them to over 4,000. They were coding every case with over 100 codes, including subcodes. I am not going to take you through all of that agony. I'm going to take you through some highlights. We haven't actually analyzed everything we've coded. We've analyzed these highlights so far. First, we look at how often the courts believe. We use the word credit, meaning crediting. It's a legal term meaning basically believe or accept allegations of abuse. And how often did they reverse custody, which I'll define for you in a few minutes. And primarily allegations from mothers and reversals of custody from mothers to fathers, but you'll see as I go. Secondly, a couple of points about gender differences, quite interesting points. And lastly, a couple of findings, very significant findings about the role of guardians ad litem, who are neutral professionals appointed to advocate for children's best interests. Sometimes they're appointed to advocate for children's wishes, but most often it's for their own independent judgment of best interests. And custody evaluators were appointed by courts also to assess best interests. They tend to be psychologists. Okay, so first, what do we find about the rates at which courts accept mothers' abuse claims in cases in general, not involving alienation claims from the father? Mothers alleging domestic violence were believed 45% of the time, less than half the time, which surprises many people. Mothers alleging child physical abuse are believed less than a third of the time, 29% of the time, and mothers alleging sexual abuse of children are believed less than 1/5 of the time, 15% of the time, very, very rarely believed, even without the toxic influence of an alienation claim. It averages out to 41% of the time that mothers' abuse claims are being accepted, and it shows obviously that courts are far less likely to accept child abuse claims than partner violence. And this was very interesting to me because I had had this impressionistic sense from our case experiences that courts were really dug in against child abuse claims. And I have my theory, which is that they think child abuse is really going to get in the way of shared parenting or father custody, and they don't want to hear it. Whereas domestic violence, they're a little more willing to credit that because they don't think it precludes father custody or shared custody. Okay, now when you look at the cases where the father who's been alleged to be abusive is responding by calling the mother an alienator, what we found was that those cross claims dramatically reduce the rate of crediting of abuse, especially child abuse. So domestic violence is credited now only 37% of the time. Child physical abuse goes down from 29 to 18% of the time. Child sexual goes down from 15% to 2%, a single case out of approximately 50. And I will give this comparison to you visually. This shows visually the difference between cases with and without cross claims of alienation. So the blue is the cases where there was no alienation cross claim, and it shows, again, what I just told you, how often courts are believing the claim. The gray is what happens when there is an alienation claim, and it shows you how much of a reduction of belief there is for each category. By the way, we also coded for mixed abuse claims, adult and child abuse or mixed child abuse, and we have that data, but I've stopped presenting it because it just makes the presentation much more complicated. And it's not, it's interesting and it raises some interesting questions, but these are sort of the core issues. So another way of putting what we found by comparing the cases with and without alienation cross claims is that the alienation cross claim reduces the likelihood of any abuse claim being believed by a factor of 2. And it reduces the likelihood of a child abuse claim being believed by a factor of almost 4. That is driven almost entirely, well, primarily by child sexual abuse allegations cases. Okay, so moving on from how often courts believe to what courts do, we analyzed what happened to mother's custody, and we defined custody losses as cases where mother started with primary physical care of the children with or without a legal ruling. As far in any case where we could discern that she was raising the kids primarily qualified as her starting with primary physical care. And at the end of this case that we were coding, if the father was awarded primary physical custody by the judge, that was a custody loss for the mother. So it's a pretty narrow definition. Again, looking at the cases without alienation cross claims, we found that mothers were losing their custody roughly a quarter of the time, average 26%, a little bit more when they're alleging child abuse, which should be counterintuitive. They should not be losing custody more often when they're reporting child abuse. But of course, again, this goes to the way courts see mothers who allege abuse, which is that they see them as bad actors. Now, when there was an alienation cross claim, the rates of custody losses virtually double. So a minute ago, we said 26%. Now it's an average of 50%. Domestic violence, they're losing custody about a third of the time. Child abuse, well over half the time. They're losing custody now because of the alienation. Well, I shouldn't say because. We can't prove causation. We can only prove correlation. When there's a cross claim of alienation, we see this huge jump in rates of custody losses. And again, I give you the same information visually. when fathers cross-claim alienation, they have almost 3 times the odds of taking custody away from mothers who are alleging any kind of abuse than when they do not cross-claim alienation. We were able to also hone in on cases where the courts believed the abuse, whether it was domestic violence or child physical, but still gave custody to the person who perpetrated the abuse. Now, bear in mind, this is a whole range of types of abuse, a spectrum, and not necessarily brutal abuse in every case. Whatever qualified as intimate partner violence or child physical abuse, and we define that in our coding manual. I can't tell you it off the top, but I'm happy to follow up with anyone who has questions about that. What we found was that 62 cases out of 477 cases where the court confirmed the abuse, 13% of them, they still gave custody to the abuser. Now, most of these were probably because they thought the mother was an alienator. So being an alienator trumps being an abuser. And we haven't broken this down as cleanly as we intend to in the future. Okay, moving on to gender. What did we find when we started looking at reverse gender cases? 2 primary findings. First of all, our data confirmed what everyone's impressions and anecdotal experience is about how alienation is used in a gender biased way. Alienation is not defined as necessarily being something that mothers do. Fathers can do it, and the alienation field are increasingly harping on that because they're trying to gain legitimacy by saying fathers do it too. It's not a gender biased theory. But what we were able to show, which again we see experientially, is that when we combined all the cases with an alienation cross-claim, when one parent was accusing the other of abuse and the other parent was cross-claiming alienation, we found that when fathers cross-claimed alienation, they took custody away 44% of the time. I'm sorry, not only abuse, with and without abuse. So some of these cases, about half of these cases, were cases where no one alleged abuse, according to the published opinion online, which may or may not be fully representative of what happened in the case. But as far as we know, no abuse claims mixed with cases where there were abuse claims. We found that when fathers accused mothers of alienation, they took custody away 44% of the time. When mothers accused fathers of alienation, they took custody only 28% of the time. And that was statistically significant difference. Mothers have twice the odds of losing custody compared to fathers when they are accused of alienation. So that's very confirmatory of what we see impressionistically. Now, we found some very interesting gender parity or superficial gender parity findings, which may or may not reflect actual functional gender parity. First of all, we found that when courts believe that a parent is an alienator, fathers and mothers lost custody at identical rates, remarkably identical, 71% of the time. Alienation is the kiss of death. What I would say about that is that basically courts use the alienation label to say, evil, you are bad. And of course, then you lose custody most of the time. In the cases, we separated out the cases with no known abuse claim, according to the opinions we were reading. It was, again, about half the cases. We found that in those cases, although fathers lost custody a little less often than mothers did, these differences are not statistically significant. One could call that a form of gender parity, although it's really unclear. It's just not enough numbers. And the reason it's not enough numbers is that the way we defined loss of custody, we looked at who started with the children, and a lot of the opinions don't tell us that. So we were only looking at a shrunk subset of our data, but also relatively fewer fathers start with custody than mothers in these cases. And so the numbers are just generally lower for these comparisons. However, I will say that this gender parity finding, everybody in the alienation field has robustly ignored because they've wanted to ignore our study and our data. And the fact that this actually gives some arguments to the alienation field, they've refused to acknowledge. Okay, lastly, the issue of guardians ad litem and evaluators, the neutral professionals who get appointed by courts to figure out best interests and either advocate or report about that. What we found, and again, this comports with what we've seen, everyone thinks, oh, well, you should appoint a GAL and then they will advocate for the child and then the child will be protected. But what we experience in our cases is the opposite, that the GALs side with the fathers who are accused of abuse to a remarkable degree. And the data confirmed that. What we found was that mothers' odds of losing custody are 3 to 5 times greater when there is a GAL in the case. And their odds of losing custody are 2.5 to 6.5 times greater with an evaluator in the case. And that spread reflects the different types of abuse claims. The sexual abuse claims result in higher rates of custody losses. We also found we were able to look at the reverse gender cases where fathers are alleging that mothers are abusive, and we found that these professionals have no effect on fathers' likelihood of losing custody. And of course, the net effect of all of that is that these professionals significantly increase the gender differential in outcomes in these cases. Because of time, I'm making this very quick, but I'm going to end then with study limitations that need to be kept in mind. First of all, we've been accused of claiming that every time a court rejects a mother's abuse claims that we're saying that it's wrong. We're not saying that it's wrong, although anecdotally and experientially we believe it's often wrong. The study doesn't show whether that's right or wrong. The study just says what the courts are doing. They're rejecting mother's abuse claims. There's other data that you can compare that to that suggests that that's wrong. The study also, important limitation is because we were collecting electronic data, most of the cases were cases that had been appealed. Bear in mind that we were not coding what the appellate court did, although we did code that as an extra point. We were analyzing what the trial court did as described in the appellate opinion. So of course, cases that are appealed may not be fully representative of cases that are not appealed, but we have a little bit of a comparison on that. You look at the asterisk here. We were able to do some comparisons because we were surprised to find several hundred opinions that were not from appeal courts. They were from trial courts that were electronically published. We were able to do some comparisons in terms of whether those were systematically different from the appellate opinions. Yeah, that whether the categories of cases were very different. And what we found was, yes, there was a difference in rates of custody losses by mother in the trial cases that had not been appealed compared to the cases which went to appeal. Belief is just not particularly different. We think that that is perfectly understandable, that when mothers lose custody is a major trigger for appeal. And so cases where they're not losing custody are less likely to be appealed. And so what we're saying about what trial courts are doing is a little bit tilted toward the cases that are appealed. Finally, the way we categorized the cases as abuse or not abuse cases or alienation or non-alienation cases was based on our data, which was judicial opinions. And it is very possible that some courts did not mention prior allegations of abuse or alienation that they had basically discounted and not taken seriously. And so in the way that we compare abuse cases with or without alienation claims, we can't be 100% sure that those were with or without alienation claims. But if anyone wants to know, I think this limitation actually strengthens our findings. It does not weaken them. And contact information, if anyone is interested, I am running the National Family Violence Law Center at GW Law. Happy to add you to our e-list and to share our publications.
Thank you so much, Joan.
You're welcome.
So I'm so sorry we're so horribly out of time. So what I suggest is if you could tweet or email any questions, and Adrienne has kindly given her slot for us to show Emma Katz's video. So if you want to grab a coffee and fruit out in the foyer and come straight back in for the main plenary. Brilliant. Thank you so much, and sorry about the timekeeping.
Hi. I'm Dr. Emma Katz, author of the book Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives, and I'm here to... Hi, I'm Dr. Emma... Hi, I'm Dr. Emma Katz, author of the book Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers'